Oh, we can hear the music. Oh, no.
Katie, we having a hard time hearing you, I believe.
So the music is on, right?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the final day of the virtual workshop portion of the 2023 Community Workshop Series of the Seattle MLK Organizing Coalition. I'm Katie Harris. I'm chair of the coalition's workshop committee. I'm a white female with short curly gray hair and purple glasses. I'm speaking from my house with a bookcase and Bolivian textiles behind me. This morning, you'll be participating in the 5th of 15 workshops. After today's workshops, and there are 3, we'll offer 8 in-person workshops at Garfield High School on Monday morning before the annual rally and march. And tomorrow, we'll hold a virtual Young Leaders event where young people interpret Dr. King's legacy through discussion and performance. This event will be interpreted in Spanish, Somali, Amharic, Vietnamese, and Cantonese. You can learn about all of these events on our website. I'll put the link in the chat in a minute. Before I introduce you to this morning's moderator, I want to mention a couple of logistics. This workshop uses a webinar format. When you put something in the chat, only the presenters and I will see it. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function. Finally, if you'd like to use closed captioning, please look for the captioning button at the bottom of your screen. You may need to look for the 3 dots that say more if you hover over it. This morning's workshop is about how to be critical news consumers. We'll look at the ways white supremacy and racist narratives show up in the news, why that matters, and 3 questions you can ask to think critically about any story. At the end of the workshop, we'll have a Q&A section, but feel free to put your questions in the Q&A at any time during the workshop. And now I'm going to turn the mic over to our moderator, Troy Landrum, who leads KUOW Radioactive's community programming and outreach strategy. Troy, thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our workshop today. Before we do introductions, I'll start with a land acknowledgement, and we'll go straight into introductions of our staff and what we'll be doing today. Although we're not physically in the same place, I want to acknowledge that I and the KUOW station sit on the unceded ancestral lands of Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples, indigenous peoples who are still here, continuing to honor and bring to their light their ancient heritage.
Thank you, Troy. Hi, welcome to Radioactive's Media Literacy Workshop. My name is Marianne. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a 20-year-old Black Muslim woman who wears a hijab. I'm a community outreach assistant for KUOW Radioactive, and I'm also a Radioactive alumni, and I've graduated from UW this past summer.
Hey, my name is Kyle Norris. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a 47-year-old white American guy. I'm queer, and I've got speckled silver hair. I have been a mentor with Radioactive for 6 years, but I've worked in public radio for 20 years. And honestly, the best stuff I do is with Radioactive because I get to support young people telling the stories that they want to tell about their lives.
Awesome. Hello again, I'm Troy Landrum. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a 32-year-old Black male. Black American male. My hair is very curly and I've been growing my locks for about 3 years now. I'm on staff at Radioactive KUOW as a program producer with a focus on outreach and community engagement. I'm also a fiction writer and a freelance journalist for the South Seattle Emerald.
Oops. And Radioactive Youth Media is the teen journalism program at KUOW Public Radio.
KUOW is Seattle's biggest NPR station, and we're a news outlet with reporters and editors, just like the Seattle Times or the Washington Post. You can always hear us on 94.9 FM on the dial, and when you listen, you're going to hear things like local, national, and international news and radio shows.
And at Radioactive Youth Media, youth and young adults like me work alongside KUOW journalists to produce podcasts and radio stories about the issues that matter to me in my community.
So sharing people's stories and reporting on their experiences is an act of power. In fact, the three of us were talking about this earlier this week, and here's some of the ideas that we kicked around. We talked about the role of storytellers in African cultures and the way that knowledge is shared through stories, and that stories are actually oral libraries, and they share information and knowledge from generation to generation, and then they get remixed and passed down. So I also like to think about how many people that one single story can touch. When one of our youth producers tells a story about their life, they put it on the radio and it scatters out there and all kinds of people can hear it.
And at Radioactive Youth Media, we're learning to be professional journalists, so we talk a lot about this. We are always thinking about the power that we hold when sharing information and how we can disrupt dominant narratives in the stories we produce. Today, we're going to talk about how to be critical news consumers. We'll look at the ways white supremacy and racist narratives show up in the news, why it matters, and 3 questions you can ask to think critically about any story.
We'll note that this workshop is not about disinformation or other types of fake news, which are media created to deliberately misinform people. Instead, we're focusing on how reliable news outlets like KUOW or the Seattle Times can perpetuate racist narratives, often unintentionally, in factual reporting.
And stories matter because they shape the way that we understand ourselves and the world. Stories shape the choices we make and the policies we support and the ways that we solve problems. And we're not just talking about the news stories. This is true of the stories that we all tell everybody every day, and from the things we post on social media to the conversations that we have with our neighbors. Because stories have the power to shape our reality. And it's very important that we understand the power dynamics at play in all the stories that we tell and we hear.
So let's get started. So throughout today's workshop, we'll be using a tool called Poll Everywhere to get feedback from you. If you like to respond to polls and answer questions throughout this workshop, you can go to pollev.com/radioactive. POLLEV.com/radioactive, RADIOACTIVE, from your smartphone or your computer. So when we ask questions, you will be able to respond there, and your answers will show up on the screen anonymously. Just a heads up, there are a bunch of people in our session, so not everyone's answer may appear. So let's give it a try. So go ahead, everyone, take your smartphones out, take your laptop out, and go to pollev.com/radioactive. There you'll be prompted to answer our first question. And our first question is, drum roll please, where do you get your news from? Let's start throwing in our answers at pollev.com. So we got the New York Times, Seattle Media, awesome, awesome. Reddit, awesome. BBC, these are really great answers. TikTok, cool, cool. Nice. South Seattle Emerald, woo woo. Awesome. Axios newsletter, awesome. I'm loving these answers, y'all. Keep them coming, keep them coming. I remember my mom playing PBC every day on the radio and on the television. Instagram, cool, cool, cool. Awesome. So throughout our process, continue to think about those things. We're going to stop the responses right now and just continue to think about those as we go throughout our process. So our next question is, to get your creative juices going, let's try another one. What do you hope to learn in the session? On this poll, if you agree with something else answer, you can upvote it by clicking the thumbs up to the left of the response. So we got people who are anticipating viewing news through an anti-racist and inclusive lens. Awesome. Critical thinking and processing of news. More reliable forms of media. Awesome. It's in the lead, viewing news through an anti-racist and inclusive lens. Better strategies. Anti-racist in reporting and writing. Awesome. Keep them coming, y'all. Looks like we got a tight tie. Awesome. So what you guys are excited for today is viewing news through an anti-racist and inclusive lens and anti-racism in reporting and writing. So we're super excited to share that with you all today, and super excited to get into our PowerPoint because it talks a lot about history. It talks a lot about the things that you guys are anticipating on hearing. Thank you for that. I'm going to clear those. We'll move on to our next thing. So as we go through the workshop, we also encourage you to ask us questions using the Zoom Q&A function. We'll answer as many as we can at the end, and we're excited to share our experience as youth journalists with you and journalists. Just a heads up though, if you have questions about the KUOW newsroom or about specific stories that we didn't work on, we might not be able to answer those, but we will try our best to answer as many as we can at the end of our session. Y'all ready to get started? I'll pass it over to Marian.
Awesome. Thank you, Troy. So the goal of this session is for us to think critically about the media we consume. And to do that, it is helpful to get a little context. So let's start by looking at the long history of white supremacy and anti-Black racism in American journalism. This history comes in large part from an essay published in 2021 called Media 2070. A content warning, this history references racist violence. So since the colonial era, media outlets have used their platforms to inflict harm on people of color, especially Black people and Indigenous people. In the 1700s, the first US newspaper published hundreds of thousands of paid slave ads, facilitating and profiting from the buying and selling of enslaved people. And in the 1800s, white lawmakers passed anti-literacy laws that made reading and writing illegal for Black people. But there was always resistance. Black leaders published newspapers across the country anyway. In 1847, Frederick Douglass started publishing an abolitionist newspaper called the North Star. And in the 1880s, an incredible journalist named I.W. Wells investigated lynchings across the country, exposing them as acts of terror in her newspaper, the Memphis Free Speech. And here's a story that reinforces the horrible disease of white supremacy within our media and news outlets. In 1898, a white supremacist named Joseph Daniels was the publisher of North Carolina's largest newspaper, the News and Observer. That year, Wilmington, North Carolina elected a multiracial city government. Daniels didn't like that, so he helped stage a violent coup, leading a mob of 2,000 white men to overthrow the newly elected government. It was the only armed overthrow of a local government in our nation's history, led by a newspaperman. 20 years later, in the summer of 1919, a white man killed a Black teenager named Eugene Williams in Chicago, and the police did not arrest him. This sparked widespread race riots across the country known as the Red Summer. A government investigation into the riots found that white newspapers played a major role in inciting the racial violence. And then 50 years ago, in 1968, another government report on racism and racial violence in the US called the Kerner Commission Report again called out the white bias of the press. The report said, the press has too long basked in a white world, looking out of it, if at all, with white men's eyes and white perspectives.
Thank you, Marianne. So there's this simple but profound idea of media literacy, and that's that all media messages are constructed. And I'm going to quote Troy right here because we were talking about this earlier. And he said the foundational thing is that the stories we hear in the media are created by one person, right? And their message is informed by their identity and how they grew up and through their background and values. And what history tells us is that white supremacy has had its hand in all of this. It's touched that individual person who's telling that story in the media, and white supremacy is in all of our systems too. That's all a Troy quote. Okay, from newspaper articles to documentaries to tweets to the billboards that we see on the highway, all those media are created by people who make a series of creative choices. And if some words are spoken on the radio, others are edited out. If one picture is used in a news story, lots of other pictures did not make the cut. Because even the best news stories are never an exact representation of reality. And because decision makers in major newsrooms continue to be mostly white, often wealthy, many of our media messages are distorted by a white gaze and white racism. And I want to underline this. I'm talking about the bias that shows up in factual reporting from trusted news organizations. So here's an example. It comes from June 2021. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran this headline, and that's "Building Matters Too." That's a play on Black Lives Matter. And this is a story about architecture during nationwide protests against police brutality. So this title equates the murder of people with the destruction of property, which are obviously not equal. And this paper issued an apology and the leading editor resigned, but the harm was already done. And things can be more subtle too. Remember, Radioactive is part of KUOW, the NPR station. And in 2021, KUOW published a story about a man who was called anti-Asian slurs at Home Depot. The original headline called it a bias incident, which is legal language. But listeners wrote in and they pointed out that bias suggests something subtle and subconscious. And this was straight up racial harassment. So the reporter changed the headline. So the next one is more recent. two publications, The Hill and Politico, and these are pretty middle of the road publications, meaning they don't sway super left or super right. These two publications published stories about the US December jobs report. And we're going to share one more example. This one is about news coverage of the police killing of Michael Brown. In 2014, a Black teenager named Michael Brown was killed by a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. The New York Times ran a pair of stories on the front page, one profile of teenager Michael and one profile of the officer who killed him. Artist and media critic Alexandra Bell created the stories and their layout on the page. The image is from an art installation Alexandra created. So take a minute and study it. And pay attention to the headlines and to the layout, to how much space each story takes up on the page. I'm also glad we have a youth journalist with us in the building, Marianne, who is a radioactive alum, and she just finished journalism school at University of Washington. And just Marianne, briefly, I'm wondering what your take is on this.
Yeah, I remember a lesson specifically on this page during one of my journalism classes, and I even remember how my heart sank when I opened it up. So many thoughts went through my head, but the only one that remained was why. Why was this allowed to be published? Why is it that I, as a student journalist at the time, could see how harmful this is, but a reporter of an acclaimed publication who probably went through multiple edits could not? And it is okay to ask these questions because these questions are important for necessary change to be made.
Thanks, Marianne. Then Alexandra created a different front page. So imagine what if this were the front page the New York Times had published that day? And this front page tells a different story. A teenager with promise. So what we're talking about here is called narrative framing. So the story's frame is the angle or perspective from which it's told. And a story's headline, its physical layout, the photos, the interviews, the people we hear from, and the facts included are all part of that frame, right? And the way a story is framed can perpetuate racist narratives, even in factual reporting.
And to illustrate this idea, let's take a look at 3 different news stories about the same incident. This is a made-up example, and if you're a note-taking kind of person, we invite you to make a chart like this. We will read you 3 different news stories about the same made-up event. As we read each story, think about or write down who the story is about, what the issue is at the center of the story, and why it is happening. The why, or the root cause, might not be explicit, it may be inferred. You'll do this for all 3 stories. And I'll pass it to Kyle.
Okay, so we're gonna do version 1. The title is Rats Bite Infant. And here's the text. An infant left sleeping in his crib was bitten repeatedly by rats while a 16-year-old mother briefly left their apartment. A neighbor responded to the cries of the infant and brought the child to Central Hospital, where he was treated and released into his mother's custody. The mother, Angie Burns, said, "I was only gone 5 minutes. I left the door open so my neighbor would hear him if I woke up. I never thought this would happen in the daylight." Okay, so if you're jotting this down, go ahead and note who the story is about, what is the issue at the center of the story, and why the issue is happening. And once you've done that, we are going to throw up a question on Poll Ev. The question is, if you were the journalist and you were, investigating this story, who would you want to interview next? It can be someone we've referenced in the story or perhaps another person we have not referenced. So jot that down into Poll Ev. Who would you want to talk to next? A vote for the neighbor. The mother. An official or a health official, mother, neighbor. Cool. So I like it. People are thinking of different options, different people to interview about this story. How about I'll throw it to Marianne for version 2?
Thank you, Kyle. So version 2 is rats bite infant, landlord, tenants dispute blame. An 8-month-old boy was treated and released from Central Hospital yesterday after being bitten by rats while he was sleeping in his crib. Tenants in the apartment complex said that repeated requests for extermination had been ignored by their landlord, Henry Brown. Brown claimed that the rat problem lay with tenants' improper disposal of garbage. I spend half my time cleaning up after them. They throw garbage out the window into the back alley, and their kids steal the garbage can covers for sliding in the snow. Just like before, you can note the who, what, and why of this version. And I will pass it to Troy.
All right. Now that you've written number 2 down, here's number 3. Rat bites rising in city's zone of death. Rats bite 8-month-old Michael Burns 5 times yesterday as he napped in his crib. Burns is the latest victim of a rat epidemic plaguing downtown neighborhoods known as the zone of death. Health officials say infant mortality rates in these neighborhoods approach these in many developing countries. A public health department spokesperson explained that federal and state cutbacks force short staffing at rat control and housing inspecting programs. The result, noted Juan Nunez, MD, a pediatrician at Central Hospital, is a 5-fold increase in rat bites. He added, the irony is that Michael lives within walking distance of some of the world's best medical centers. So take a minute to compare the 3 stories. Then answer this question at pollev.com radioactive. The question is, so as you look at those 3, the question is, what are the major differences in these 3 stories? If y'all need me to go back to the 3 stories, I can do that. Awesome, awesome.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah. So who they imply is to blame is coming in first. The main subject. It's a tie between those 2.
Man, this pool ebb is slick.
It really is. I'm loving it.
And we can hear from everybody, in the room, even though, yeah. Okay, so perspective is in first place. Second place, who is centered in the story. The main subject is third place. Oh. And while all of these stories that we heard, they have the same set of facts in them, each one has a really distinct definition of the issue, of who is responsible, and how the issue might be resolved.
Sorry, my mic was acting weird. I was surprised by how easily I shifted my focus to a different person or institution each time a new story was read. And that just proves just how much power stories have.
Okay, but like practically at the end of the day, why does all of this matter?
Well, I'm glad you asked. We know that media messages shape the way we understand the world. So I guess for me, it's about solutions and accountability. We care about naming the root causes of problems in news stories, because if we can't identify the real problem, then we won't be able to identify a real solution.
One of the things that stands out to me, I'm thinking of that third story, which really zooms out and suddenly we're talking about like systems of power, the bigger picture kind of a thing. And also we hear from that local health official who can shed light, again, big picture zooming out. And I don't know why I love this so much, but we hear the baby's name and he gets, right, some humanity in that third version. That stands out to me.
Definitely. Okay, so I get that part of being a critical news consumer is thinking about how the stories we see are framed. But there is so much media out there, I feel totally bombarded by news stories all the time. How can I think critically about all of it, especially when the bias of media framing can be so subtle?
That's a really good question, Marion. So for me, there are three questions I ask when I read a news story. And actually, these are also questions that Radioactive and KUOW journalists ask when they write a news story. So the first one is simple. Who made this? So before I read something or retweet something, I look to see who the author is. That helps me understand how the story might be framed. You can also ask, how would this story be different if someone else had written it? When I'm producing a story, I ask, am I the best person to tell this story? And the next question I ask, whose voice, perspective, and expertise is amplified in this story? Who is omitted? So this one is about representation. Being able to recognize and name missing perspectives is a critical media literacy skill. Who we aren't hearing from is just as important as who we are hearing from. So who we aren't hearing from is just as important as who we are hearing from. Let that sink in, please. And the third question that we ask, how do structural, historic, legal, economic inequities show up in this story? So another way to ask this, where does power show up in this story and why does it show up? I'm talking about structural power, economic power, or political power, or even legal power. Like how the third version of the Rat Bite story names funding cuts at the public health and public housing departments.
And I really love these questions. I love them because they can be used to analyze news articles, but also because you can use them to notice your representation, not your representation, to notice representation and power dynamics at play in other areas of your life, like in a school curriculum. You know, I'm thinking back to the first question you asked about authorship. Who made this? I feel like the All Buildings Matter headline and the article about Michael Brown would have been really different if they were written by Black journalists.
I really agree with that statement. Representation in the newsroom is not only solution to bias in journalism, but it's part of it. And that's part of the reason why Radioactive exists.
And that is so true. Youth voices and perspectives aren't heard enough in the media, and stories about youth that are written by youth are totally different from the ones written by adults. At least that's been the case for the stories I've reported. Speaking of representation and youth voices, there are some stories I would like to share. One from me and a couple of other young people like me who I co-produced a podcast that I think gets at what we've been talking about. The story is about police brutality and how media messages shape the way people understand police violence. If the story is triggering to you, please feel free to take a breather and sit out for this one. No judgment at all. We want you to have the ability to take care of yourself. So I produced this story with Radioactive Youth producers Hong Ta and S.A. Follows. You'll hear Hong in the first clip. You'll hear Hong first in the clip, and then the clip is about 1 minute long. And again, it references police violence.
We grew up in a generation that saw people of color killed by police officers over and over again. As kids, I feel like we've been numb to the pain of another day, another killing.
So it takes me back to when
We grew up in a generation that saw people of color killed by police officers over and over again. As kids, I feel like we've been numb to the pain of another day, another killing.
So it takes me back to when I first got my driver's license, and my dad and mom would keep on telling me, if you get pulled over by the cops, do not show any attitude, put your hands on the dashboard, don't say nothing, don't do anything, because they just want me back home.
I believe the media plays such an important role in the portrayal of police officers and their victims. They have the power to influence the way people think. And these everyday people can go on to be jurors. They make huge decisions about what will happen to a case.
In addition, the media stereotypes Black and brown people as dangerous for their community. Police officers are meant to protect, but who are they protecting if they're killing part of our community? Like Hong just said, All those things we see in the media, such as videos, pictures, etc., perpetuates this idea and continues the cycle of another murder, another acquittal.
Looking back, I am in awe of the work that Hong, Essay, and I did on this podcast. And the fact that this was our first time producing a podcast and only being 17 or 18 didn't draw us away from telling this important story. And I even remember where we huddled together over a phone and called a police officer, and we're pretty much just hammering him with these questions. And at that point, he was just like, okay, no. and and I also remember seeing a video of the brutal murder of Philando Castile and being so confused with what I saw and how the news reported it. And so I decided to take the role as producer to educate myself and to create a story that can be a form of guidance for listeners when coming across these stories in the news cycle. And so for 1 week, we became mindful of the clips we used, the people we interviewed, the words we used in this piece. The process was difficult, but I don't regret my part or doing my part. And Black stories deserve the authenticity that is created by Black journalists. Black communities deserve to hear more stories about Black joy and excellence, and this is why representation matters. If we have representation in the newsroom, it would provide a bigger support system for journalists like me. Oh, sorry. And we spoke a lot about representation, the history of white supremacy in our media, the powerful responsibility of being a news consumer, along with the 3 important questions to ask. Now we want to share more youth-led stories with you so that you can get an idea of the stories you want to share with the world, especially stories through the lens of our big questions. Who made this? Whose voices and perspectives are amplified in the stories, and whose are omitted? And how do structural inequalities show up in the story? And so this story is produced by Radioactive graduate Adar Abdi. Her story is about why she loves fantasy books. She says she turns them to escape racism and sexism, but finds those same messages in the novels she reads. So as you listen, think of the 3 questions and how the questions shape the way you listen and consume this piece.
Shivering and shaking through the beautiful green forest, I finally noticed the bridge, and I couldn't believe what I saw next. Walking on the magical snake charm bridge was Anime, with beautiful milky white skin. Her skin was so smooth as silk. She had eyes as blue as the Aladdin Ocean. She looked so fragile and feminine. If I touched her, she would shatter. She was the epitome of natural beauty. She was without a doubt a woman.
That was a very icky paragraph.
What? Who are you to say that? I wrote that myself.
Well, I like to call myself a fantasy book fanatic. Fun fact, last year alone, I read a total of 68 fantasy books.
Wait, why do you like fantasy books so much?
Well, it gives me an escape from reality. When I'm reading, I feel like I'm in another world, a world where there's no sexism, racism, or any other ism for that matter. There's something so magical about that.
But what's wrong with fantasy? You love fantasy, I love fantasy.
I've been noticing that a lot of fantasy books have problematic issues. The same things I want to escape from are exactly what I'm seeing. So many authors say the whole point of fantasy is it's not supposed to resemble anything from our world. But if that statement is correct, then why do so many authors constantly use white skin tones to describe their characters?
Okay, but that's just one example.
Or why when authors want to include POC characters, they usually put some sort of stereotype twist. Like time and time again, the evil character or villain is someone who's either dark-skinned or has BIPOC features, and the good person is usually someone who has Eurocentric features. Like why can't the character have orange skin with purple eyes?
But it's all fiction. Why does it matter?
Let me stop you right there. I want you to remember all the fairy tales you read growing up. Did those have a direct correlation on how you perceived the world?
Okay, could you give me an example?
Okay, let's take Cinderella. She had an evil stepmother, right? Now, I want you to think at that point after watching, did you fear having any sort of stepmother because she might be evil? I know I did, and I only thought this because of the Cinderella story.
Okay.
Or how about the boogeyman hiding under your bed? Did you fear this before you ever heard a story about the boogeyman? Probably not.
Oh. Oh, I never noticed that.
Exactly. This is why having characters that constantly have Eurocentric features is an issue. It makes it seem that beauty only has one form, and that if you have anything that is different, it is ugly in a way. Like if all the attractive people in fantasy books only have Eurocentric features, what are the people who don't have those features going to think about themselves? Also, people are going to think that beauty automatically equals whiteness.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense. But now I feel like basically all the fantasy books have this in their writing. I mean, what am I supposed to do now?
Well, I want you to know you can read books that have great representation as well as an amazing plot. I love the vibe of your fantasy paragraph in the beginning, but I think you can add some spice. Maybe take some of what we talked about today and put it in your writing.
Okay. How about this? Shivering and shaking through the beautiful green forest, I finally noticed the bridge, and I could not believe what I saw next. Walking on the magical snake charm bridge was Anime. She had magnificent lavender skin that was so glowy. The color of her eyes will be forever engraved in my brain. It was this bright amber color. She truly looked beautiful. She looked so out of this world.
Wow, that was great. I loved it.
I really love that piece. And our last, oh, sorry. I just saw the slide. Um, so from everything that we've talked about today, my big takeaway is this. All media messages are constructed. And because we live in a racist society, racist bias shows up in all our institutions, including journalism, even in totally factual stories. But we have the power to be critical news consumers. We can ask questions about authorship, representation, and power dynamics in all the media we consume. And we can consume a diverse media diet. That means getting our news from multiple sources. We recommend a mix of global, national, local, and hyperlocal news sources like the South Seattle Emerald. We also suggest reading multiple sources coverage about the same event. And we can seek out stories produced by people who are historically underrepresented in the media, like queer people, indigenous people, and youth. And finally, when news organizations get it right or when they get it wrong, let them know. If it's a legitimate news organization, you can find the journalist's contact information and reach out to them. Fun fact, KUW reads and categorizes every piece of feedback. And so if you want to build a burner email, go ahead and do that. And that said, I'll end by saying it shouldn't be all up to the consumer to address racism in the media. Newsrooms across this country, including KUW, are working toward diversifying their newsroom and interrogating the structures they have in place that perpetuate white supremacy and racism in journalism.
So we've covered a lot in this workshop, and we are, coming to the end of it. So if you want to learn more about all this, we've got a number of links to great resources at the end of these slides, which we will send out. And then finally, if you want to check out more stories by Seattle young people from Radioactive Youth Media, including stories that I've done, Marianne's done, that Troy's worked on, you can find them at kuow.org/radioactive. And we are all over social media. Our handle is KUOW Radioactive. And if you are a young person, say between the ages of 15 and 18, and you want to get involved in journalism, you should totally apply. Applications for our paid summer intro to journalism, it's our radio journalism workshop, are opening in mid-February of this year. It's basically like your first job, and we pay you well to be in this program. So you can find out more about all that at kuow.org/summer. All right, so we are ready for some questions. We would love to answer your questions about this workshop and especially around questions having to do with youth journalism, youth journalists. And then just a reminder that we know all about our program and Radioactive, but there are other things sometimes about KUOW that we are not knowledgeable about and can't answer. So if you can focus on that kind of stuff, Radioactive, youth media, and what we talked about in this presentation, we would love that.
So we have a question. How do editors influence the final presentation of an individual journalist's story?
Mm. We want to all chime in on that. Kyle, I think you have more experience with radio journalism and the editing process. So, you know, I would love for you to start us off with that, and then I can like add, you know, my experiences as well as a local journalist.
Sure. You know, I call editors the sort of silent partner in journalism. Like, you don't necessarily know that they worked on a story, but they absolutely did. And I'll just speak to how we do things in public radio and at Radioactive. When we come up with our ideas in Radioactive and in the newsroom, we have an idea for a story. We first bounce it off an editor, and that's their job. Their sole job is to edit stories, to see what they think the story, how it is, what we potentially could do, which direction to go in. So we're talking about it. Then the reporter is doing some research, interviewing people, bringing that back to the editor, sometimes just having a conversation with them. But basically, when the reporter does their first draft, writing the story, using the sound clips from interviews and sounds of where they went and what they recorded, they play that for the editor. The editor gives feedback, might say, go back, we're missing this voice, or there's too much of this voice, let's change it this way. The reporter does another version 2, another edit. Sometimes there's some smaller, you know, fewer changes, and then there's an edit 3 with the editor. That's usually always the way it goes. So 3 edits with an editor. And they are, I would say, they have a heavy hand in shaping the story. We also, like, just when you're one reporter, you have biases, you have preferences, you know, there are things that maybe you haven't made clear in the story, and an editor is helping you sift through those things with the goal to make it clear and interesting and informative for the listener.
Awesome. Mary, you want to talk about your experience in the editing process at Radioactive and even at like your internship?
Yeah. Well, I can say my experience is a little bit interesting because my first journalism experience was at Radioactive. And I remember just kind of course, being nervous stepping into an edit meeting, but at the same time, Kyle was my mentor. Didn't mention that earlier, but I just remember meeting with my editor and also with Kyle by my side. It was especially helpful at that time for my thoughts and my opinions and my experiences to be acknowledged in the piece that I was creating about my mother and I and the importance of political representation. And so even though it was nerve-wracking to hear that I probably can't have my mom speak Somali in the piece that I was creating, that there was leeways to figuring out a way to create such a rich, full story. And so just the acknowledgement of that and that whole process was really fulfilling. And so coming out of that and then interacting with other publications was very different. And so it was kind of just a wake-up call for me that not all publications are like Radioactive, and to also just be able to stick by my standards, if that makes sense, but at the same time being respectful to my editor at the time, who's offering very helpful feedback, of course, but at the same time knowing where my roots are, which was at Radioactive, was especially helpful in navigating that relationship with an editor, because it can sometimes be in an editor or reporter relationship can get, you know, kind of blurred when you're just trying to create a story from a place that you are trying to tell it, and an editor being like, there's no way we can do that kind of story. And so I'm just always reminding myself of why I do this, and being as clear when communicating with my editor about that.
And I can talk
sorry,
about,
go ahead.
I can talk about from my perspective, because my expertise is really in print journalism. And it's similar to the editing process of what radio journalists do. But we're not listening. But the editor is a huge part of the process, just to make sure, like, to fact check, to make sure things are correct on my end, to make sure that I don't need another verb in order to in order to portray this sentence. If I need stronger sentences in this certain paragraph, and they're huge to my process, just like they are as radio journalists. I look to them to really influence the way that I write and the way that I come across to my audience. I really look to them to help me do that. And if there's things that I'm stuck on, I look at them to like have another objective experience and to like place themselves as a reader. Like, do you understand this if you were reading this? Like, how is this coming across? So it's a lot of questions on my end that I'm asking of my editor, and a lot of questions on their end that they're asking of me. And I think through both processes, I think an editor should know your work well. An editor should know who you are, should know who you represent, because you can run into an editor that really doesn't understand your work or understand your mission in your work, and they can really like change the way things are coming off. So if you have an editor, make sure that you are displaying and telling them who you are, and give them time to understand who you are as a writer, as a radio journalist as well.
Thank you. Here's someone who would like your thoughts about the limited coverage of news in general. For example, why are some stories overcovered and why are so many invisible, i.e. Ukraine versus Yemen?
Anybody want to jump on that one first? That's a really good question. That's something to think about.
It's a great question. I'm thinking about what I want to say. I think there is a wide range of stories that are out there if you go looking, if you in a variety of places, right? And I think if you don't, it can feel easy to to feel like you're hearing the same three stories over and over again. So I worked for many years at Michigan radio, and people would always complain that we weren't covering a particular topic and that we were covering other topics too much. I'd also say people, and again, just in radio, people listen to the radio. God, I want to say it's like for 15 minutes at a time. It's a very short, right? We're just listening in these blips. But fun fact, when you work at the radio station, they play it all day long on the speakers. So you're hearing the whole day of radio, which is you're hearing a range of stories that go in different directions and stuff. So again, I guess my question is how often are you listening? Would be one thing, because I hear a range of stuff. I hear some really interesting stuff on the BBC at 3 a.m. Right? The world, like just so, which is a time most people are not listening. But when you host the morning show, you have to wake up pretty early and you're in the station, you're hearing the BBC. So I would encourage that person, can you try and listen to some shows at some times you don't, and seek out different things, because I am hearing a range of stuff.
I want to add on that, because I think that was very, very well said, Kyle. I think, like Kyle said, finding different ways to listen, different ways to, find this information. And it goes back to what we taught, just like, what sources do you have in your life? What multiple sources do you have in your life are trustworthy to you? And the key word is multiple. Having just not one place that you listen to or one place that you read, but just having multiple sources. Because if two stories come out at the same time from two different places that you are really comfortable with, that is given really good facts, then you can decipher between the both. You can see how this is covering this certain thing and this is covering this other certain thing. So the key is having multiple sources, multiple ways of listening, multiple ways of reading and getting connected to that. And you can, Marion and Kyle, you can tell me, if I'm wrong about this, but at KUOW, there is a way in which you can have a conversation with the people at KUOW and talk about the topics that you want to talk about. You can share with them just like what you want to hear on the radio. Like if there's a certain topic that we are not covering, you can directly, talk to someone about that or voice your opinion. And these are things that we discuss every week between our journalists, between, radioactive staff, between management. We talk about those things. We talk about the complaints people have, the praise people have, and we also talk about stories that people want to hear that they feel we're not covering.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Troy said, as a listener, you have power in that. Let people and journalists know when they're missing a story you think they should cover. Let them know when they do good and you think they brought depth. They brought a perspective you don't normally hear. They told a story you were longing to hear about, or that surprised you, or that you learned something about. And again, we just mentioned this, but KUOW reads every email that comes in, and they make those available to every member of staff to read. So when you write in and say, hey, this topic, you guys are not covering it, please cover it. 150 people see that. So the power is in your hands, and let journalists know what you want more of and when they do stuff right. Marianne, did you have a final thought on all this?
Yeah, I feel like I can add about who has accessibility to the newsroom. And that's not only for like a reporter role, but also for people who are listeners who are listening in, if they're able to pitch in, or if they have access to internet, if they have access to those numbers, if they have access to those ways of connecting with the newsroom to speak about it. And so I agree both with what Kyle and Troy both said. And I feel like the reason why I've delved into telling stories of things that I see, from within my community as a young person, is because you can clearly see the overcovered stories versus the invisible ones. And so I always just think about accessibility, like who has access to the stories that I'm creating right now, and how can I dismantle that barrier when I'm creating those stories, and can it get a little bit tiring sometimes when I'm thinking like that? But at the end of it's a good cause and it's a good reason to do that, to think that way. And so it's an interesting little like journey of like what's the next overcovered news story versus what isn't being told. And it's always just asking yourself these questions of who's the author, who's being omitted and who's being allowed to tell their stories, and so forth. So yeah, I'd like to add that.
So we have the question, what are some methods we can use to answer question 1, who is the author? For critical thinking when we analyze a news article, if and when we don't have access to the resources that the article may have written for, i.e., there are some sites that require us to pay for subscriptions we may not have access to, or we may not have social media like Twitter.
I can start us off with that. I think if you don't have access to like social media or other ways to like understand who this author is, if you have access to internet, if you have access to Google, that's your baby right there. That's your gift. You can highlight the author's name, you can Google search them, see who they are, what they represent. If they are writing in the news, there will be multiple things about what they've written in the past, or there'll be certain ways that that you can figure out who this person is. You can go directly to the website to see who is on staff. The most websites that I've seen, for journalistic areas or journalistic places, they show the faces or the pictures of those who are writing these articles. So Google is your friend. Going on the home website is your friend as well, to understand what they've written in the past, to see what they look like, to see what they represent, to see the work that they've done in community. Google is your gift.
I'll just add my quick 2 cents. I love free knowledge. Librarians are super knowledgeable too. And even asking librarians about media sources, or, like, I don't know this radio show or this news organization, this newspaper, to a librarian. Do you know about it? Just, can you tell me a little background? I've had good luck learning about those kinds of things by asking librarians.
I feel like you guys both answered the questions really well. And I just think newsrooms should be more accessible. So I'll leave it at that.
So we have 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. For what reason are news media sued? And if it's a public figure, are there different criteria?
Oh man, that's a whole can of worms. I'm not qualified to answer that, but it is a big concern. And people can threaten to sue you for all kinds of reasons. Again, I am not super knowledgeable about that, but yes, it is a concern.
I'll have to defer to Kyle on that answer. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not, in the legal system in that way. I mean, these are things that we've heard of through our own media, through our own things. Like, if things aren't factual and there hasn't been a process of, fact checking certain things, I think those are one of the biggest things that I've seen in the public happen when newsrooms don't get the story factually correct. That's what I've seen. But I'll defer to Kyle and say that I'm not super knowledgeable about that.
I can add as well, just from my experience with the police podcast, it was in 2019, so some of the memories are a little bit blurred. But I remember we couldn't use the word murder in the podcast. And so like that was like a hands-off word that NPR was like, yeah, you can't say that. And so I remember we had to go back and just like rewrite the script and then revoice it. And so it's like it's like matters of that. Just one single word can get you in trouble, or can get you sued, or can get some, attention on you. And you can imagine for like me and Hong and Essay being just looking at each other like, what? But at the same time, just like it happens. And like that's the reason why we have editors. That's why we have our coworkers. That's why we go through so many of these meetings to double check so that these things don't happen. But it does happen. And yeah, it's a tricky situation to be in.
And then last question, can you share the slide deck with the people who attended?
Yes, we absolutely can.
Okay, so the way we can do that is that we send a follow-up email within a couple of days of the workshop to the people who attended, and we can include a link to the presentation. So thank you so much for your presentation. It was quite wonderful. I want to close by letting people know about the upcoming events, and also to ask participants, please, to fill out the evaluation form for this workshop. So I put in the chat a link to information about the workshops coming up on Monday at Garfield. And that link also has information about the remaining workshops today, and there are 2 more, and general information about the other coalition events, and finally a link to the evaluation form. So I want to thank everybody for attending today, and thank you so much to our presenters. It was really great, and we love having you. And also I should mention that our presenters will have an in-person workshop on Monday on how to tell your story. So that we hope you'll attend that one on Monday. So that concludes our presentation. Thank you so much. Bye.